They left me $0 in the will, so I watched their empire burn. When my family's will was finally read, in a room that smelled of old money and fresh grief, I was left with absolutely nothing. Zero. The lawyer, a man who had known me since I was a child, couldn't even meet my eyes as he read the final brutal passage. In front of my perfectly composed mother and my two smirking siblings, my own father's words echoed from beyond the grave, branding me a disappointment, a son who would never amount to anything. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was that their multi-million-dollar empire, our family's shiny, revered legacy, was a masterfully constructed house of cards. And in their infinite arrogance, they had just handed the matches to the one person who knew exactly where to light the fuse. Before I walk you through how it all went up in glorious, righteous flames, do me a small favor. Hit that subscribe button and make sure you ring the bell. You're not going to want to miss the ending to this story. And when you're done, let me know in the comments. Have you ever been so completely underestimated by your own family that it pushed you to become more powerful than they could ever imagine? My family was the name behind Sterling Holdings. To the outside world, we were the absolute picture of dynastic success. My father, a titan of industry, was the big-shot CEO whose name was whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence. My mother was the consummate socialite, her life a whirlwind of charity galas and magazine profiles. And my older brother and sister, they were the charismatic, photogenic heirs, groomed from birth to take the reins. They closed multi-million-dollar deals on sun-drenched golf courses and smiled with predatory charm from the covers of business journals. Our name didn't just mean wealth, it meant power, prestige, and a legacy carved in stone. And then there was me. I was the quiet one. The family's resident black sheep, not because I was some wild rebel, but simply because I was fundamentally different. I didn't have the stomach for their particular brand of ruthless, cutthroat ambition. I was meticulous, I was careful, and I was cautious. As my father so often loved to say, usually with a dismissive wave of his hand, I lacked the killer instinct. So while they groomed my siblings for the boardroom and the corner office, they sent me off to accounting school. I wasn't destined for glory, you see, but I could still be useful. I could be the one tucked away in a back office, silently managing the endless, complex spreadsheets that funded their lavish lives. For 15 years that was my role, the family's glorified high-functioning bookkeeper. I balanced their Byzantine accounts, I processed their endless invoices, and I did all the tedious, unglamorous grunt work that my flashy, important siblings found so far beneath them. All the while I was relentlessly told that I wasn't really contributing, that I was just keeping the lights on while they were out slaying dragons. When my father passed away from a sudden heart attack, I wasn't naive. I never expected to be handed the keys to the kingdom. But I suppose a part of me, the part that still foolishly craved a father's approval, expected something. A small acknowledgement for 15 years of quiet, thankless, loyal service. We all gathered in the lawyer's mahogany-paneled office. The air was thick with a cloying fake sadness. My siblings were already whispering excitedly about which divisions of the company they'd take over, their grief a transparently thin veneer over their avarice. The lawyer began to read. My brother, as expected, was named the new CEO with a controlling majority share. My sister was gifted a massive portfolio of commercial real estate and a huge, unassailable stake in the company. Their eyes met across the table and they exchanged tiny, triumphant smirks. Then the lawyer got to me. He cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on a point on the wall just over my shoulder. To my youngest, he read, the words dripping with my father's posthumous condescension, who never quite grasped the sterling way of life. I leave my complete collection of family photo albums, in the hopes that they might one day remind you that family is about more than just money. And that was it. A box of old photographs. My inheritance was nostalgia and a final, parting insult. My mother, seeing the stunned look on my face, placed a pitying hand on my arm. He just knew you weren't cut out for this world, dear, she whispered as if it were a kindness. All that pressure, all that stress, it was for the best. It protects you. They had spun my complete and utter disinheritance as an act of love, a way to shield me from a world they were convinced I was too weak and incompetent to handle. They left me with a box of dusty memories and a lifetime of being patronized. In that moment, sitting in that suffocatingly expensive leather chair, something inside me didn't just break. It was forged into cold, hard, unforgiving steel. The weeks that followed the will reading were a disorienting blur of hollow condolences and the quiet, simmering hum of my own cold fury. I methodically packed up my office at Sterling Holdings, taping up cardboard boxes that contained 15 years of my life. My brother, swaggering in his new role as CEO, had already sent out a company-wide memo announcing my departure. He'd framed it as me bravely taking time to find my own path, a neat and tidy narrative that painted him as a supportive brother while simultaneously erasing me from the company I had served my entire adult life. It was during that final soul-crushing process, while clearing out old digital files from a forgotten encrypted server that only I managed, that I found it. A folder I hadn't opened in nearly a decade, labeled simply contingencies. It was my father's private, off-the-books ledger. Years and years ago, when I was still young and eager to please, he told me it was a place for creative tax efficiencies, a digital sandbox for aggressive, but supposedly legal write-downs and asset diversions. I was young and I took him at his word, never questioning the man I so desperately wanted to impress. But I wasn't young anymore. And I was no longer the loyal son. I was the meticulous accountant they had trained and the scorned outcast they had created. So I started digging. I copied the files to a secure hard drive and took them home. Night after night I sat in my small apartment, the city lights a distant blur, poring over those files. I began the painstaking process of cross-referencing every entry with the official books, the ones I knew like the back of my hand. What I uncovered made my blood run cold. This wasn't creative accounting. This was a massive, systemic, decades-long fraud scheme of breathtaking audacity. There were dozens of shell corporations registered in offshore tax havens, laundering money so effectively it simply vanished. There were falsified invoices inflating the company's value by hundreds of millions of dollars to secure enormous bank loans they never should have qualified for. There were ghost employees on the payroll, names on a spreadsheet whose multi-thousand-dollar weekly salaries were being funneled directly into my father's hidden private accounts. The entire Sterling Empire, the very source of their immense power and family pride, was a spectacular lie. For a second, a single fleeting second, I actually hesitated. This was my family's name. This was the legacy my grandfather had built. In a twisted, painful way, it was my legacy too. But then I saw their faces in my mind. My brother's arrogant smirk, my sister's dismissive laugh, my mother's pitying glance as she told me I was too weak for their world. They didn't just deny me my inheritance, they mocked my very character. They ridiculed my integrity, my caution, my meticulousness, the very traits they had unknowingly relied on for years to hide. Their monumental crimes. My revenge would not be a dramatic, screaming confrontation. That was their style. Mine would be quiet. It would be precise. It would be accounting. I spent the next month working with a singular, obsessive focus. I assembled a comprehensive dossier, a detailed roadmap of their decades of fraud, so clear and undeniable that any forensic accountant could follow it directly to a conviction. I gathered encrypted bank records, damning email chains, and copies of the falsified loan applications. Then, using an untraceable email service from a burner laptop at a public library across town, I drafted a simple, anonymous message. I sent it to the public enforcement divisions of both the SEC and the IRS. The subject was simple: anonymous tip regarding financial fraud at Sterling Holdings. The body of the email was just one clinical sentence. I have reason to believe Sterling Holdings is engaged in a long-term systemic fraud scheme, and here is where you should start looking. I attached the 3 most damning documents as a starting point, a digital key to their fraudulent kingdom. Then I powered down the laptop, walked out of the library into the cool night air, and for the first time in my life, I felt the exquisite thrill of lighting a fuse. For 6 long weeks there was nothing but silence. The gears of federal justice can grind excruciatingly slowly, and I knew an informal inquiry could take months before it ever became a formal investigation. I started to think my tip had been dismissed, buried in a digital slush pile of crackpot theories and dead ends. The doubt began to creep in. Then the first tremor. It was a tiny article buried deep on page C12 of a financial journal, mentioning that federal regulators were making preliminary inquiries into the financial practices of a large privately held East Coast conglomerate. No names were mentioned, no specifics were given, but a cold, electric certainty shot through me. I knew. 2 weeks later, the earthquake hit. I was making coffee in my small, quiet apartment when my phone lit up with a news alert, followed by another and another. The headline was stark. Federal agents raid world headquarters of Sterling Holdings. It was everywhere. On every news channel, there were the live, breaking images, stern-faced federal agents carrying box after box of documents and computer hardware out of the gleaming skyscraper I'd spent my entire adult life in. My phone started screaming with a relentless barrage of calls and text from my brother, my sister, my mother, my cousins. I let every single call go to voicemail. I listened to their frantic, panicked messages. My brothers were filled with rage and disbelief, my sisters with hysterical, weeping terror. Later that night I called my sister back, my voice a perfect mask of calm concern. "I just saw the news," I said evenly. "I can't believe it," she sobbed into the phone. "This has to be some kind of horrible mistake. A business rival must have set us up. This is a lie." "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding," I said, and the words tasted like the sweetest, most delicious irony I had ever known. A few days later they called an emergency family dinner. Not at a fancy restaurant, but huddled together in my mother's huge, silent mansion, which now felt less like a palace and more like a tomb. They looked like they had aged 10 years in a week. The supreme, effortless confidence was gone, completely replaced by a raw, primal animal panic. They paced around the cavernous living room, throwing out wild, desperate theories, blaming everyone but themselves. They blamed business rivals. They blamed a disgruntled clerk they had fired last year. They even blamed foreign governments. They never once looked at me for an opinion. I was just a ghost at the table. The quiet, harmless, simple-minded accountant, a non-entity in this high-stakes world of corporate warfare. The sheer arrogance was still there, even in their desperation. At one point my brother actually turned to me. "You," he said, his voice shaking with fury, "go through the books. The official ones. You have to find what they think they have on us. Find the mistake." The audacity left me breathless. He was ordering me to find the evidence of the very fraud he and his father had committed. Later his desperation boiled over. He slammed his fist on the antique dining table, rattling the crystal glasses. "This is war. This is exactly why Dad didn't want you in the real business," he yelled, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You're too soft for this. You would have folded on day one." I let his words hang in the heavy silence. I took a slow, deliberate sip of water and looked him right in the eye for the first time all night. My voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the tension in the room like a shard of glass. "Maybe the problem isn't that I'm too soft," I said quietly. "Maybe the problem is that you built a house on a foundation of sand, and you're shocked the tide finally came in." They just stared at me, their faces a mask of pure, uncomprehending confusion. The metaphor was completely and utterly lost on them. They didn't get it. But the statement wasn't for them. It was for me. It was the moment I took my power back, not with a roar, but with a quiet truth they were incapable of understanding. The collapse was faster, more brutal, and more complete than I ever could have imagined. The evidence I had provided was the single loose thread that allowed federal investigators to unravel everything. The sheer, staggering scale of the decades-long fraud made it a national story. Financial pundits talked about it for weeks. It turns out that while many family businesses failed to transition to the next generation due to a lack of planning, ours imploded because the only thing being passed down was a legacy of profound corruption. Faced with overwhelming and irrefutable evidence, my family did exactly what I always knew they would. They turned on each other with the savagery of cornered animals. They each hired their own expensive lawyers and immediately started cutting deals, pointing fingers, and desperately trying to shift the blame. My brother's legal team claimed he was a new CEO, tragically unaware of the historical financial practices established by his late father. My sister's defense was that her real estate portfolio was managed at arm's length and she had zero operational knowledge. They threw our father and each other under the bus without a moment's hesitation. The sterling family unity they were so proud of was a complete sham, just like their balance sheets. The sterling name, once a symbol of power and untouchable prestige, was now synonymous with disgrace and fraud. The empire was frozen solid, its assets seized to cover decades of lies and stolen funds. I watched it all unfold from the quiet of my small apartment, a world away from the blast zone. And the feeling that settled over me wasn't glee or triumph. It was peace. There was no champagne, no celebratory fist pump, no triumphant laughter. There was just a profound, quiet sense of closure. It was never about the money. I wouldn't have touched a single dollar of their dirty, blood-soaked fortune. This was about justice. This was for the people who told me my integrity was a weakness, when their absolute lack of it was the fatal liability. They had called me a disappointment, but in the end, their own insatiable greed was the true architect of their downfall. I just held the door open and let the consequences walk in. I used the modest severance pay I'd been given to go back to school. I got certified as a forensic accountant and opened my own small financial consultancy firm. I help small business owners, entrepreneurs, and dreamers build their companies the right way, on a foundation of rock, not sand. My office is a small room above a bakery, and the smell of fresh bread is a constant reminder that I am building something real, something honest. They left me $0 in the will. But in doing so they gave me something else of incalculable value: my freedom. Freedom from their constant judgment, freedom from their toxic ambition, and freedom from the gilded cage I had been trapped in my whole life. And that is an inheritance you can't possibly put a price on. Thank you for watching my story unfold. If you've ever had to start over, to reinvent yourself and build something that was truly and authentically yours, I want to hear about it in the comments below. It's not always the easy path, but at least it's our own. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories. Like, share and tell us where you are watching from about justice finally being served. I'll see you in the next one.